Amen. We could do weeks worth of studies into those reform lines and the different histories we can take to them. We've been understanding more and more, particularly these last 5 years from 2014, in this dispensation, the importance of parable teaching. So I'm hoping that as we study what we're about to, people understand that we're referring to these histories as a parable, and using in unlocking them using the same rules of parable teaching that Christ employed. So we went through the lines of end of ancient Israel, end of modern Israel, and we saw that parallel, the three groups. There was just a couple of key points that I wanted us to take from that into our next study. And those 2 points, 2 primary points. First of all, I wanted us to first see this history of John the Baptist as he gives his message from his birth to the baptism of Christ. That in this history, John the Baptist is giving a message. They're coming out of the time of scattering. God is going to gather his people. And he gives his message. And within that message, he's saying, we must prepare the way. The time is at hand. We're coming to the end of all these time prophecies. There's a Saviour being born. All of which is correct and true. But he has some misconceptions that he's taken from the church of that day, from the Jewish synagogues and the Pharisees. And that concept is that there is a Saviour come, who is a king, is going to rule on the throne of David, that's going to conquer the Roman nation and essentially make the glorious land the leaders of the free world. So instead of, in his message, he is focusing on the errors of the Jewish nation. He sees the issues within the church of his day, but he still has this message primarily focused against the Romans. There is a switch where you go from the first messenger to the second, and we read quotes that referenced that, how John recognized that as Jesus began to fulfill his mission, that the people's attention and understanding had to turn from following John's voice to following Christ's voice. And I just want to call that the imprisonment of John. John's imprisonment and death. And this really is the beginning of when Jesus begins to work. He has been seen in this history. I want us to see that he has been seen here. You have the Samuel Snow's letters in this history. But now, here where we would mark July 21, Samuel Snow giving his message, you see the formal beginning of that work of the second messenger. From the time Jesus begins his work to the cross, he's preparing the disciples. And increasingly in this history, it begins to be recognized that Jesus is not fulfilling all the expectations of John the Baptist or the expectations of the disciples that they've learnt from John the Baptist. This begins to create uncertainty and tension. And even though Jesus prepares them for that, many of them come to this point still expecting Jesus to conquer the Romans and be a king. And when, first of all, it all begins in the upper room at the foot washing. It's in the upper room of the foot washing that Jesus gets down on his knees and demonstrates what it looks like to be part of his kingdom. It isn't this dictatorial, sought-for position as leaders that he's calling the disciples to accept. Even though they loved Jesus and his message, they were still expecting to be at his right hand as he sits on the throne of David. They don't understand what they're being called to do. And here at the upper room with the foot washing, they begin to see the humility of Jesus and how he intends to serve the people. And while for the disciples this surprises them, it chiefly hits the heart of Judas. And it's Judas who realizes here at the foot washing that this is really not going to happen. This kingdom is not going to be set up the way he wants it to be set up unless he bypasses Jesus and forces Jesus to become a king. And it's here that Judas separates. And the other disciples, as they go through this experience of Gethsemane and finally, just before the cross when Jesus is taken captive, they run away. And Jesus has warned them and warned them that this is about to take place. So we have a couple of different layers to this reform line. We can see Jesus as the messengers in this time period, that God has raised up people just the way he raised up John the Baptist with a message. So you can see him representing this message, but you can also see Jesus as representing the movement, the true movement. So you come to this history and you have a division, two sides with a different prophetic understanding of what the kingdom looks like. And it's here that is the separation and the crisis, the greatest separation and crisis that ever faced that early church. And we know this is the history from the cross to Pentecost. So we bring that into our reform line. We have 1989, and in this history we have the message of Elder Jeff. 1989 to 9/11. After 9/11, we can place a wilderness, different prophetic lines that show us this history. We'll say the foundations are laid. But then we come to a waymark where we are clearly seeing, identifying prophetically a change in messenger. And this occurs at this waymark, the midpoint, which would line up with Samuel Snow or the beginning of the work of Christ or Joshua, and we can identify that waymark as 2014. We identify this waymark as 2019, and this waymark as Panium. Raphia and Panium, the two battles illustrated in Daniel 11. So first, the first messenger, Elder Jeff. Elder Jeff writes the Time of the End magazine. We go through this history, and already between 9/11 and 2014, you're already identifying the second messenger. In 2009 and 2012, there's a message given as relates to time setting, in the 2520. But it's from 2014 forward that you have a change in leadership of the movement. And that change in leadership has increasingly, particularly in the last few months, been sounding more and more contradictory to what Elder Jeff believed in this history and wrote in the Time of the End magazine. And the current crisis we find ourselves in is that we find ourselves just prior to this waymark. I'm going to label this foot washing as August this year. It's already been laid out towards the end of August. That had been laid out. That work of organisation in Germany split this movement into two separate groups. Those who believed that we were rejecting the message of John or Elder Jeff in the Time of the End magazine, and those who could understand, based on this increase of knowledge, that while we differ from some of his conclusions that came from Laodicean Adventism, and he recognises they came from Laodicean Adventism, that God is teaching his people more clearly than ever before what his kingdom looks like. So it's primarily this history I want us to identify, the separation and the crisis we currently find ourselves in. because most of us are aware that that is what we're going through. And this has, particularly from August, been an issue over a different prophetic understanding. And what Elder Jeff has been saying is that we have rejected his message of the Time of the End magazine. Particularly his understanding of how he identifies the UN and globalism as the dragon power. So here John the Baptist is focusing against the Romans. They're his key enemy that he expects Christ to destroy, not realizing that Christ's message all the way along is focusing about the destruction of the glorious land, not the Roman Empire. Our message, particularly from 2014, as we have begun to teach, we are teaching about what is happening in the glorious land that we see fulfilled under Donald Trump, unilateralism, dictatorship, differing from the message here that's focusing on the concept of the UN. That's really, in a nutshell, the differences between the two groups. And what he is saying is that because we differ in any way from the Time of the End magazine and his beliefs when he wrote it, not necessarily the words, but Elder Jeff's beliefs as he wrote that magazine, therefore we must be in apostasy. But you can see that at the end of ancient Israel, you had the exact same scenario where there's misunderstandings that have crept into John's message from the Laodicean Jewish church structure, from the Laodicean Adventist church structure. So if this is the final apostasy that the disciples had to face in their reform line, it occurs just before the cross. I want us to be able to identify that this is the final great apostasy and division. If you ask someone to think about the history of Christ and to name the first waymark that comes to their mind, it's the cross. Even though on that whole reform line, the cross only is visible on a fractal level, because their mission was to go to the world, which is 34 AD. You have to zoom in and see as a fractal to identify the cross. And yet that waymark still carries with it the most significance. The same with Millerite history. If you asked someone to identify Millerite history, the key waymark, they would say October 22. October 22 exists only on a fractal level. It's the same waymark. But it carries with it a great deal of significance. The final great apostasy and division occurred just prior to the cross, and it's what we're currently facing. If this is the final great apostasy and division, I want us to look at the first great apostasy. The last great rebellion, go to the first great rebellion. And it's a prophetic rule we've identified for some time, that the end is illustrated by the beginning. So if you see the last great rebellion, you know that you're going to be able to trace the same steps in the first great rebellion, and the first will explain or unlock the last. There's a specific message that begins to be opened up in 2014. This is a dispensation. Within this dispensation, there's two waymarks, 2014 to 2019. One is an increase of knowledge, and one is a formalization. Same as in every history. 5 waymarks, 4 histories, 4 dispensations. In every dispensation there's a message that's unsealed, given to God's people, then formalized, and then the people are tested upon that message. This is the test. What is testing people today? When you see that message given, it also must come with a messenger or messengers. So in this history, this was Elder Jeff. He gave that message. In this history, it's Elder Parminder. In this history, I want us to see it's 2 people. And identifying that there's 2 people in this history that are identified as the leaders of the movement helps unlock the first great rebellion. So if we were to go to the first Great Rebellion, just find that. I want to mark it as the time of the end. I'll just call it the beginning. From the beginning, if we were to go back to the first Great Rebellion, at the beginning, in heaven, how many leaders do you have?
2.
You have 2. You have the Father and the Son. So you have 2 leaders at the very beginning. Are these leaders equal?
Yeah.
We're going to go to some quotes. SR 13.1. I might put them over here. SR 13.1. Lucifer in heaven before his rebellion was a high and exalted angel, next in honour to God's dear Son. His countenance, like those of the other angels, was mild and expressive of happiness, his forehead high and broad, showing a powerful intellect. His form was perfect, his bearing noble and majestic. A special light beamed in his countenance and shone around him brighter and more beautiful than around the other angels. Yet Christ, God's dear Son, had the preeminence over all the angelic host. He was one with the Father before the angels were created. So from before the angels are even created, you have the Father and the Son in equality. And we find in heaven there is peace. We'll work our way down. SR 13.2. The great Creator, this is the Father, he assembled the heavenly host, that he might, in the presence of all the angels, confer special honour upon his Son. I'll just double check I have. Okay, we'll go to a different quote. We'll come back to SR. First Spiritual Gifts 17.1. First Spiritual Gifts 17.1. The Lord has shown me that Satan was once an honoured angel in heaven next to Jesus Christ. His form was perfect, he had a noble, majestic bearing. I saw that when God said to his Son, "Let us make man in our image," Satan was jealous of Jesus. He wished to be consulted concerning the formation of man. He was filled with envy, jealousy, and hatred. He wished to be the highest in heaven, next to God, and receive the highest honours. Until this time, all heaven was in order, harmony, and perfect subjection to the government of God. So at the beginning, the Father and the Son were equal, and there was peace in heaven. But did Satan know that the Son was the equal of the Father? No. It comes as a surprise to him. Satan does not know that the Son is equal to the Father. But it reaches a tipping point when Christ goes into a meeting with the Father. When God says to Jesus, "Let's make man in our image," this makes Satan jealous. He thought that he should be the one brought into communion with God and consulted. So there is a meeting. What you have is these two people, God the Father and the Son, these two beings, beginning to work together. And they go into working together in a way that is found to be secretive. Because Lucifer isn't allowed to participate in that work. He's separate. It's the Father and the Son that are discussing. Until this point in time, there had been peace, order, harmony. And then this meeting. Now you have the beginning of jealousy. And from this point in time, there begins to rise up a rebellion. In the heart of Lucifer. This stays secret. It arises in Lucifer's heart in a secret way. He isn't yet expressive. We'll go back to SR 13.2. The Father knows what's arising in the heart of Lucifer. He assembles the heavenly host that he might, in the presence of all the angels, confer special honour upon his Son. The Son was seated on the throne with the Father, and the heavenly throng of angels was gathered around them. The Father then made known that it was ordained by himself that his Son should be equal with himself. Were the Father and the Son already equal? Yes, but was it made public knowledge? No. So God decides he's going to bring all the angels together and make a proclamation. He's going to say in this proclamation that the Father and the Son are equal leaders. The word of the Son was to be obeyed as readily as the word of the Father. Lucifer was envious and jealous of Jesus. Yet when all the angels bowed to Jesus to acknowledge his supremacy and high authority and rightful rule, he bowed with them. But his heart was filled with envy and hatred. Christ had been taken previously into the special counsel of God in regard to his plans, while Lucifer was unacquainted with them. He did not understand, neither was he permitted to know the purposes of God. But Christ was acknowledged sovereign of heaven, his power and authority to be the same as that of God himself. Lucifer thought that he was himself a favourite in heaven among the angels. He had been highly exalted. But this did not call forth from him gratitude and praise to his Creator. He aspired to the height of God himself. He gloried in his loftiness. He knew that he was honoured by the angels. He had a special mission to execute. He had been near the great Creator, and the ceaseless beams of glorious light enshrouding the eternal God had shone especially upon him. He thought how angels had obeyed his command with pleasurable alacrity. Were not Lucifer's garments light and beautiful? Why should Christ thus be honoured before himself? He left the immediate presence of the Father dissatisfied and filled with envy against Jesus. Concealing his real purpose, he assembled the angelic host. He introduced his subject, which was himself. As one aggrieved, he related the preference God had given to Jesus to the neglect of himself. He told them that henceforth all the sweet liberty the angels had enjoyed was at an end. For had not a ruler been appointed over them, to whom they from henceforth must yield servile honour? He stated to them that he had called the angels together to assure them that he, Lucifer, no longer would submit to this invasion of his rights and theirs. Never would he again bow to Christ. That he would take the honour upon himself, which should have been given to him, and he would be the commander of all who would submit to follow him and obey his voice. There was contention among the angels. Lucifer and his sympathizers were striving to reform the government of God. They were discontented and unhappy because they could not look into his wisdom and ascertain his purposes in exalting the Son. So at the beginning, they are equal, but it is not visible, publicly visible, and there is peace in heaven. It begins to be made publicly visible when God decides to create the earth, and he brings Jesus with him, and the two consult. As they're consulting, this makes Lucifer unhappy because he doesn't understand why Jesus should be treated as an equal instead of himself. This rebellion is allowed to develop in his heart until this proclamation. God assembles all the angels together and makes it a public statement that the Father and the Son have equal authority, equal in leadership. This creates an immediate rebellion, open rebellion. Satan assembles all the angels and tells them he will not submit to this government. You can either come under his leadership, which he says is the true leadership that has been ignored or bypassed by the Father, or you can side with the Father and the Son. This is the choice Lucifer gives to the angels. In this history of open rebellion, this leads to war in heaven. BC 973.4. Seventh Bible Commentary 973.4. The influence of mind on mind, so strong a power for good when sanctified, is equally strong for evil in the hands of those opposed to God. This power Satan used in his work of instilling evil into the minds of the angels. This is an information war, and we've been discussing throughout our increase of knowledge and formalization that externally what we see happening is an information war, whether that's Russia or the United States. It's a war like you would have in the Stone Age, you fight with stone weapons, or in the Bronze Age with bronze weapons. We're in the information age, and they're fighting an information war, whether that's internal or external. And now you have an information war in heaven, the influence of mind on mind. As the anointed cherub, Lucifer had been highly exalted. He was greatly loved, and his influence over the angels was strong. So I want us to note it's highly exalted. Great influence. And what was the third?
Love.
Greatly loved by the angels. Angels that were loyal and true to God sought to reconcile Lucifer to the will of the Creator. They justified the act of God in conferring honor or equality upon the Son. They clearly set forth that Christ was the Son of God, existing with him before the angels were created, and that Christ had always stood at the right hand of God. They urged that Christ receiving special honor from the Father in the presence of the angels did not detract from the honor that Lucifer had to this point received. But Lucifer refused to listen, and then he turned from the loyal and true angels, denouncing them as slaves to God's government. These angels, true to God, stood in amazement as they saw that Lucifer was successful in his effort to incite rebellion. He promised the angels a new and a better government than they then had, in which all would be freedom. To think that an angel should resist the law of God, the true angels warned the rebellious to close their ears to Lucifer's deceptive reasoning, and advised him and all who had been affected by him to go to God and confess their wrong. So he also employs a deceptive reasoning. An information war, which we've already laid in the public record as being demonstrated, particularly with conspiracy theories and disinformation. And there was contention with the angels, Satan and his affected ones, who were striving to reform the government of God, wished to look into his wisdom to ascertain his purpose. They rebelled against the authority of the Son of God. So who are they truly rebelling against, the Father or the Son? The Son. Lucifer, the covering cherub, desired to be the first in heaven. Therefore he misrepresented God, attributing to God the desire for self-exaltation, when his own evil characteristics he sought to invest the loving Creator. So Lucifer is going to attribute to God the desire for self-exaltation. When it was actually his own characteristic. And thus he deceived the angels by misrepresentation. Thus it was that Lucifer, the light bearer, the sharer of God's glory, the attendant of his throne, by transgression became Satan the adversary. So he's known as Lucifer, which means the light bearer. Lucifer, who was the light bearer, the sharer of God's glory, by this rebellion and sin went from being the light bearer to the adversary, the enemy. The loyal angels hastened speedily to the Son of God and acquainted him with what was taking place among the angels. They found the Father and the Son in conference, determining the means by which, for the best good of the loyal angels, the authority of Satan could forever be put down. In this battle, every angel would choose his own side and be manifested to all. And then you have the war in heaven. All the heavenly host was summoned to appear before the Father, to have each case determined. Satan exultingly pointed to his sympathizers, comprising nearly 1/2 of all the angels, and proclaimed, "These are with me. Will ye expel these also, and make such a void in heaven?" He then declared that he was prepared to resist the authority of Christ and to defend his place in heaven by force of might. There was war in heaven. Satan and his angels were thrown out. Not a taint of rebellion was left. All was again peaceful and harmonious as before. Angels in heaven mourned the fate of those who had been their companions in happiness and bliss. Their loss was felt. How many angels did Satan take out with him?
Just under half.
In another passage, it's described as 1/3. Some had gone over to his side that then repented and came back. So this is the first rebellion. We work on the principles of parable teaching, the same ones that Jesus employed. I want to make a point. When we look at our reform line, we see 1989, 9/11, 5 key waymarks. Do the line of the priests, 2014, 2019, Panium. And in each of these dispensations, a repeating pattern. In the first dispensation, this first history, it was Elder Jeff. What do we call the history before 1989? If there's darkness, what do you need? Someone bearing light. Elder Jeff. The light bearer comes into play. 1989 to 9/11, you have a messenger giving a message. 9/11 to 2014, we can identify those waymarks externally and internally. In this history, who do you have? Elder Parminder. The studies of the 2520 and time, 2014 to 2019. This is 2016, 2018. Increase of knowledge, formalization. In this history, I've been the one sharing that message, understanding and sharing it. So you have 3 different people in each dispensation. At this waymark, you have a change in leadership. From the first to the second. This is Boston, Samuel Snow, the Jordan, Joshua, whatever reform line you're looking at. 2014 lines up with 1798, all of which are at the beginning of an increase of knowledge. In that way they line up. Increase of knowledge, increase of knowledge. 2014 there's an increase of knowledge. That increase of knowledge, we might discuss 2016 and what begins to be understood there, and that what is put into the public record in October 2018, October 3 particularly. And then in this history it's understood that what we are seeing is not one leader from 2014 to 2019, but 2. And when there is this leadership change in 2014, it's not just one person, as you find in the history of Snow or the history of Moses or Elijah and Elisha. In those histories, there's 2 at the time of the end. Shortly after 2014, 2015, Elder Parminder is anointed, and this is where we begin to parallel internal, external. There's a change in leadership within the glorious land and a change of leadership within this movement. So externally, 2015, you have Donald Trump begins his campaigning, he announces his candidacy and begins to campaign. 2015, internally, Elder Parminder begins to teach. 2016, externally, Donald Trump elected. Internally, Elder Parminder anointed. 2017, 18, there's lines already done where you can parallel all through that history. So in 2019, externally, if you know there's an impeachment, what do you know there is internally? An impeachment. Protest against the leadership. But from this time in 2014, there's 2 co-leaders based on this model and others. And this is Parminder and myself. Most of us are aware that in the earlier months of this year, around April, Elder Jeff, although he'd been saying it before, publicly recognised. And in that camp meeting in Arkansas, Elder Jeff says, I'm passing the mantle to the second messenger, and that second messenger is Elder Parminder. He publicly announced that he was the first and that he was stepping down, he was going into retirement and leaving room for the second. That people needed to start watching and following Elder Parminder instead of himself. He identified and understood that prophetically. So throughout this dispensation, Elder Jeff has recognised that Parminder is the leader of the movement. What he did not recognise is that they were 2 and that they were equal. No one protested, mostly, when Parminder took over leadership of the movement. That was done without any great deal of anxiety or trouble on people's behalf. Most people willingly and happily accepted that. There's been peace throughout this history. But then it comes to the formalization of the message. And in October last year, I travelled to Arkansas to give that message. And it became apparent, and some people commented on it, that it was clear that in giving this message and in the months afterwards, that in a leadership kind of way that Parminder and I had begun to work together. as that message was shared, and my position within the movement became, for some people, confusing. And tension began to rise. Elder Jeff has recently said that he decided of his own, he made his own decision that from I might rub this out so it doesn't look so confusing. That from the giving of that message in October of 2018, he came to a point months before this division and controversy began, that he would no longer listen to my videos or that of Elder Parminder. And before he stopped listening, he also decided that he would no longer concentrate. He didn't want to look at what was being shared. He was already rejecting. In fact, when the message was given in October, I think I've described that in Germany and in Zimbabwe, for those that have watched those videos, that the message given in October he did not accept, he did not understand. But he pretended to, or he was talked into it. So he felt comfortable saying that he did. But even now he said that he didn't then accept it either. This begins to create jealousy and conflict within the movement. It became known through different prophetic lines that Parminder and I are equal as leaders of the movement. It was decided at the German camp meeting that I would be ordained as an elder. And it will be shown prophetically that we are equal leaders. This ordination occurred on August 31st this year. This is at the German camp meeting. That night there was to be a meeting with the FFA ministry in Arkansas between the elders of the movement, Parminder, myself, Tabo and Marco, and Future for America, the North American branch of the movement. That first meeting of August 31st was when everything went wrong. It began to break down. We decided to stop the meeting, give people a time to think, come back once they had suggestions of how to move forward. We came back together shortly after, September 1st. By midnight, September 1st, there was a total split. Elder Jeff had already shut down bank accounts, changed passwords, completely separated himself from the movement. It occurs on the same days at the same point in time as there is a proclamation that there are two equal leaders of the movement. Now the rebellion is open. Since then, he has been putting out videos saying all people must choose a side, his government or our government. And I named really the key argument behind that, his understanding that we're in the message given in this 2014 to 19 time period, primarily from October last year to now, we are not completely fulfilling his understanding in this history. And he says that because we have not, we are in rebellion to him. But in 1989, he is the one that begins to open up our understanding of line upon line. And if he would only consult the line that most closely mirrors ourselves, our own reform line, he would see that that has already been understood prophetically in the message of John. So from August to the beginning of September this year, there's a proclamation made that in the government of the movement, there are two equal parties. And on the same day, the movement begins to split. On the following day, it's made official, and people must choose which side they stand on. That North American branch or co-leaders of the movement that God has not stopped leading in the last 30 years. And this has created a war in the movement. one evidence Elder Jeff continues to give throughout his presentations as to why he's on the right side. He continues to use what I would call deceptive reasoning. He says that because he's the minority and the minority is always right, therefore it must mean that his position is the correct one and Parminder and I are in error and rebellion. He continues to insinuate or state plainly that because he's the minority, he must be correct, because the minority is always right and the majority is always wrong. I have issue with that, because in the first rebellion, if you wanted to be in the minority, you're in danger. You're on the wrong side. You can't use such weak, non-prophetic arguments to decide what we believe as majority and minority. That is not a prophetic argument. That is a manipulative argument. Elder Jeff was the light bearer. He was highly exalted. He had a great deal of influence. He was greatly loved. He has employed deceptive reasoning. All of it comes from this point in time, from October 2018. Lucifer was greatly exalted. He was perfect. In his perfection, God looks at him and says, I'm going to test you. He comes to a point where God decides it's time for him to be tested. He failed that test. In the message given in this dispensation, when he's struggling to understand the message given by the second messenger, in this dispensation, Elder Jeff was tested and he failed. Because of that, we have war in the movement, all of which can be understood prophetically with parable teaching. But in his videos, he will not employ the very methodology he opened up in 1989. He will not employ line upon line studies to justify his rebellion. And now you have a split within the movement. I want to make a couple more points before we close. What Elder Jeff has said. He said, my argument is about application, not about lines. The lines are sound. And when he says this, he's talking about the lines I have taught since October. So he's talking about what I have taught. And he says that the lines that Tess has taught since October are sound. He cannot argue against the lines that have been taught. He says he doesn't have a problem with Boston, Concord, Exeter test, that repeating pattern. He says it fits, it is powerful. This is the problem he is in. And what he's being forced to say is, he's being forced to say that God led me in this history. If this is 2014, this is 2016, 2018. He's forced to recognize that what has been uncovered is of God. He can't argue against the lines. They're true in his word, they fit, they're powerful. But he's having to play a game of Jenga, start taking out bits that he doesn't like or agree with. And a study was done earlier this week that showed how God has led from 2016 forward. He says he believes the lines. It's not just the repeating pattern that he claims to believe in. One of the ones he claims to believe in is what was opened up in 2016. This was the increase of knowledge. In 2016, Acts 27 is opened up. And it's shown to be the path of two ships. These ships are giving different facets, but both explaining the course of the United States and Adventism. The United States and Adventism. One ship taking us from 1989 and opening up this history. Another ship takes us from 1798. And it shows how externally and in the United States and internally within Adventism that you have this this parallel between internal and external. So Elder Jeff claims to believe this. If you go to this first line of Acts 27, this is the ship of Adramyttium. You see 1989 Caesarea, Sidon is 911. Then you come to Cyprus. Cyprus is the midnight cry. And Myra, the shut door. If Cyprus is the midnight cry, which is what was laid out and he has so far assented to. What do you find at Cyprus? What's the issue with Cyprus in the New Testament church? The problem is that there is an external and an internal false prophet or false message. So from this point in time, you have a false prophet or a false message. You have that externally and you have that internally. And it's identifying that this is a characteristic of the midnight cry. I want to give another characteristic, this time from the Ship of Alexandria, the second reform line. It also identifies the same waymark, but what is its characteristic? Time. And you can see at that point in time, at that waymark, they calculate the distance they are from shore. There's time, and within that calculation, it represents the 2520. So a couple of things that Elder Jeff has taught that I want to quickly show how we can refute them based on reform lines. The first that he's said is that in this history of the repeating pattern, what I have taught is that it is a characteristic of this formalization. In every dispensation, a different message formalized. It's a characteristic of this formalization that it has some association with time. In this history, it's the Time of the End magazine. In this history, it's 2012. It's an understanding of time setting. In this history, October 2018, it's the prediction of 2019 as the Battle of Raphia. You can go to the full line of 144,000 and see just prior to the second advent, God gives the day and the hour. So the formalization of every message, it has a connection to an element of time. Even though Elder Jeff hasn't yet accepted time setting, he's identified that we are now in a history after the time of the end where time is now again a relevant factor, a relevant part of the message. So the formalization in every dispensation has a connection to time. Elder Jeff has rejected this waymark, and the reason he has rejected 2012 as the formalization of this message is because he must, to justify himself, reject that Parminder played a part in this history. So he's rejecting the repeating pattern. Something he claimed he believed in. He said it fits, it's powerful. I don't think even Elder Jeff himself realizes the destruction he's doing to our prophetic understanding. I don't think he's seeing the consequences. That when he does that and he removes Elder Parminder from this history, because he has to remove the second leader, that he's destroying the repeating pattern in rejecting the formalization of that message, the connection to time. One other subject I want to deal with briefly. A second point that he has taught recently. He's identified the midnight cry as it goes through our history. And he's identified the message that I gave in October as, the lines at least, as true and God-led. But what trap he's having to fall into is he's had to say that the messages that God gives are now mixtures of truth and error. So while he would say that it's God that's given this message and led in its understanding, he's also saying that it is so mixed with error that it must all be removed from their YouTube channels and no longer taught. So he's mixing this message of truth and error into what God has opened up. I'll just look up a quote. What he is saying is that what I have taught for the last year has been fanaticism, and that he must now come and deal with that fanaticism. So I just want to deal with this history, 2014 to 2019. That there is an increase of knowledge in 2016. Formalisation in 2018. On our reform line, we call this the midnight cry. And he says that this giving of this message in 2018 in October is a mixture of truth and fanaticism, and that because of that he has been raised up now, just prior to the shut door, that he has been raised up now to deal with the fanaticism that I gave in 2018 and gave throughout this history. That's his model. Problem is, go to the line of the Millerites. This is the line of the Millerites. 2014 is what waymark? July 21, Boston. 2016, the camp meeting at Concord. 2018 is Exeter. And if we went to the Great Controversy, Great Controversy 398.2. Great Controversy 398.2. At this Exeter camp meeting, how many tents are there? There's 2 tents. One tent is giving what message? The message of the midnight cry. What's the other tent giving? Fanaticism. Noise and fanaticism. It's known as the Watertown tent. So there's 2 tents at the midnight cry in Millerite history. One is giving the message of Samuel Snow. One is giving a message of fanaticism. Great Controversy. It was not the proclamation of the Second Advent that caused fanaticism and division. These appeared in the summer of 1844, where we would mark 9/11, where Adventists were in a state of doubt and perplexity concerning their real position. The preaching of the first angel's message and of the midnight cry tended directly to repress fanaticism and dissension. Those who participated in these solemn movements were in harmony. So in Millerite history, there's 2 tents at the midnight cry. One is giving the correct message, one is in fanaticism. And this midnight cry predicts October 22, the close of probation. October 2018, what must there be? 2 tents. Which tent predicted November 9, 2019? This tent. The tent you're in now. I predicted it. And everyone accepted that. So Elder Jeff is saying it's this tent, the tent that gives the message, that predicts the date, that is in fanaticism, and he must here deal with it. But if you go to Millerite history, that's not the case. It's a separate tent, and the midnight cry does not bring with it fanaticism. Instead, it represses fanaticism and dissension. And what has Elder Jeff been saying? He's saying that he has been repressed in this history. He has felt repressed. He said Theodore has been repressed, who many of you are acquainted with, and certain messages that were coming out of Africa in that time have been repressed. I don't know how many of you are aware what Theodore teaches, but it is fanaticism. It was fanaticism then, and it was the giving of this message that silenced him until now, when he sided with Elder Jeff, and it's again being taught. But when it comes back into this movement and it is taught, it is not taught as part of this movement. It's taught by a group who have separated themselves from this movement. We will not enter again into that fanaticism as was taught by Theodore. So Elder Jeff's model, he who opened up 1989 and bore that light of line upon line, who says that the message of the midnight cry brought with it fanaticism, is in direct opposition to the Millerite reform line. When what happened on August 15, when that message was brought and the shut door predicted, repressed fanaticism. That message did not bring with it fanaticism. So when we come to our own, there were 2 tents in Arkansas in 2018, and we already understood the role Theodore was playing. Why couldn't the leadership in heaven identify Lucifer? Because the people couldn't have taken it. For those who were at that time following Theodore, if we had have said publicly, this is what he's doing, this is how he's undermining the message, what would people have done? They wouldn't have understood us. And many of them wouldn't have even sided with us because we would have been troublemakers. We had to wait till it's open. And when it's open, then you can state it. At the triumphal entry, the midnight cry in that history, Jesus is weeping over Jerusalem, knowing what they're about to do. We knew in October 2018 that the message was not being accepted, but you couldn't say it. Those who were shouting Hosanna in October, the same ones are separating now because they did not truly accept that message. Line upon line, we know exactly where we are. Elder Jeff is praying. He's said that publicly. He's praying that Parminder and I go into confusion. And I find that sad for him to pray that. He's identifying that we are not in confusion now. The reason that we are not in confusion, even though it's a difficult time and there is a shaking, because our position is firm based on line upon line. Whether that's the first rebellion or the history of Christ or the history of Moses or the history of the Millerites. We know where we stand in history. This first rebellion was over equality. The Midnight Cry message has been all about equality, and it is the subject that has divided this movement. It's why we're going through this final crisis. Right before the shut door for the first group of people. A necessary experience they must go to if they're able to correct their misunderstandings and go to the second. I hope that as we review where God has led us and we understand it line upon line, it helps people who are unsure about what side to take to remember how they got here and what methodology we're supposed to be using. But I also hope those that have taken the right side are able to understand or be encouraged that God has not led us astray these years. In fact, even in their rebellion, those who are separating from this movement are giving glory to God because they are fulfilling prophecy. If you kneel with me, we'll close in prayer. Dear Father in heaven, thank you for your leading. Thank you for your leading in past histories, in all of these lines and parables that you give to us to help us to understand. I pray that we will be built upon the rock so that when difficult times and shakings happen, we know what we were founded upon and we don't question it. Please lead us through this time. I pray, Lord, for our brothers and sisters who are being shaken, who are not sure where they stand, that they will see how you have led and trust in your leading. I pray, Lord, that we will not use the tactics of others, that we will represent you correctly, prophetically, not with personal attacks. Please give us the right mindset, and I pray, Lord, that you'll continue to open up to us a greater and better understanding of your character. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.